I want to begin this talk in Genesis. After 12 chapters of creation, the mess, the chaos, disobedience, and brokenness, the journey of Genesis changes gears. But even in that gear change, God is still committed to his creation and the journey of it being a good place for humans. So, from the kind of grand, large narratives of creation, we get to chapter 12 and we zoom in close and we meet one man, a man called Abram, a nomadic Aramean man. In Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1, it reads like this. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abraham went as the Lord had told him. So what we get in this text is Abraham setting out on this journey to become a great nation, but not simply a great nation, because that as a goal in itself would never work well if you've been paying attention to Genesis so far, but a great nation with a clear mandate, a mandate to bless others, that the whole earth would somehow be blessed by Abraham's family. And so a long journey ensues wherein Abraham's family does become a nation. And this call from God remains. So when you follow the biblical story along, you see in Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 6, the word then given to this nation is repetitive of the call to Abraham. So Isaiah 49:6 says, "I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." So one man gets a call to be a blessing to the world. That man's family become a nation, and they're told to be a light to all the nations. Now that language might be familiar to you because it became significant language for the early Christians who understood themselves to be drawn into this call, this very same call, through Jesus. So Jesus himself was described as light of the world. But even he then laid that mandate upon his followers at Matthew chapter 5. In verse 14, Jesus says to them, "You are the light of the world." So this is a millennia-old call of God to a wandering Aramean, becomes the very same call that's brought to the church then and the church now. Bring light, bring blessing to the world. Like that's our core call as Jesus people. It always has been. Now, if you remember the first part of this series, we looked at a text from 1 Peter. And in that text, there was something clarified for us about this whole conversation. In chapter 2 and verse 9 of 1 Peter, it says this, "You are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light." So think about what Peter does here. He takes all the language that has been used throughout the Bible and applies it to the church. And what makes this language excellent, this language of a people brought together and called for a purpose, that purpose to be good, to bring goodness, light, blessing to the world, what makes it really excellent language is that it's totally paradoxical. The people that Peter is talking to are likely the furthest thing from royalty, probably rarely perceived as a chosen or privileged people, and often not perceived by the rest of the world as holy. Yet this random collection of people are brought together as the church, and God calls them together. He calls them royal and holy and chosen, and it's through them that God intends the world to see goodness. So the church, biblically, is called to be good, to do good, and to show good. But are we there? Is that the experience we all have of church? At the turn of this year, I read Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer's book, A Church Called Tov. Tov is this Hebrew word for goodness. It's a book that analyzes a couple of high-profile churches that ended up embroiled in scandal due to toxic and abusive cultures. And in the last several months since the publishing of this book, the landscape of public Christianity has become something of a wasteland in certain places. High-profile Christians getting caught up in scandal and abuse. Other Christians making headlines for putting their political allegiances above their loyalty to Jesus. And just one too many churches making the headlines, even in our own city, for all the wrong reasons. So the reason that I kind of like, if that's the right word to use, this book, A Church Called Tov, is it does some uncomfortable work, but important work. And it points out that these scandals of Christianity they're not one-off situations, but rather are kind of endemic across our continent. As we appear as the church to have adopted a model of leading church that in essence doesn't always take us into good places. It may not be good. But what do I mean by that? What do we mean by saying something might not be good? Well, let me try and frame it like this. I think somewhere in the last few decades, something changed in the world of church leadership. The biblical vision of church was always communities of people committed to each other and the way of Jesus for the world. Sociologists call these type of groups fictive kinships because they act and behave like biological families, even when they're not actually related. And these groups, when the early church started, spread across the empire, changing the culture and society in profound ways. The historian and sociologist Rodney Stark, he frames it really helpfully like this. He says Christianity revitalized life in Greco-Roman cities by providing new norms and new kinds of social relationships, able to cope with many urgent urban problems. To cities filled with homeless and the impoverished, Christianity offered charity as well as hope. To cities filled with newcomers and strangers, Christianity offered an immediate basis for attachments. To cities filled with orphans and widows, Christianity provided a new and expanded sense of family. To cities torn by violent ethnic strife, Christianity offered a new basis for social solidarity. And to cities faced with epidemics, fires, and earthquakes, Christianity offered effective nursing services. What did Christianity do? It reformed and reshaped the world with a different culture. As historian Tom Holland notes in his recent book, Dominion, he says, the Christian faith is at once the most enduring legacy of classical antiquity and the index of its utter transformation. Like the church changed the world. See, but this vision of the church has often been threatened. And the church has been drawn across the centuries from a good path, sometimes into something less good, or even at times not good. In recent years, the change appears to have been one where surrounding society has changed how Christianity sees itself and assesses itself. So rather than Christianity influencing culture, it seems that often we are being influenced by our surrounding culture in a very different way. And I think it's possible to make sense of some of this. There's deep complexity to it, of course, there always is with any cultural change, but I think it's possible to chart a simple pattern of what's happened to the church and in the church in three very kind of broad steps. The first thing I think we should observe is that somewhere in the last few decades, the church adopted what we might call a size success metric. That is to say, that bigger is better. We assumed that the bigger a church was in terms of attendance, then the better and therefore more blessed it must be. So churches increasingly have been considered successful solely on the basis of their size. So their theology, their works of justice, their care for people often gets ignored. And then something happened that these larger churches became well, they became the model for all other churches to follow. So conferences focused on the leaders of these churches, and they kind of pedestaled the leaders of these churches and these churches themselves, sometimes turning a blind eye to the theological status of these churches or the ethical status of these churches. Secondly, and added to that, it's kind of become an unchallenged assumption that good leadership is the key to developing a big, blessed church. And leadership became the main quality desired in pastors. And pastors started to respond to job applications and descriptions that sounded more like CEO positions than calls to pastor. And then thirdly, the vision and dream of the church became the driving purpose of the church. So you take this idea of the desire to be big because big is better, and then you incorporate this idea that we need leaders who will lead us to the big and better dream. What happens is the church becomes committed to that purpose. And subtly and slowly, everything else becomes secondary and expendable in that process. So the development of community amongst the congregation, issues of discipleship and how we grow as Jesus followers, and justice, the works of helping put the world right. But perhaps most notably, people. The way we talked about people changed. Less central, more periphery. And what starts to happen in this model is that people become valued in their mass numbers, but not as individuals, not as people created and bearing God's image. Which kind of makes me wonder, within our Western model of church, did we trade good in order to be great? But great by whose standards? In the Genesis creation story, in the story of Abraham, well, Abraham was called to be great by being a blessing, by being good. In the Genesis creation story, and we've alluded to it several times in this series, the whole of God's good creation is building towards a trajectory of placing humans at the center of God's good place. It was for them. Humans should always be central to that. So when the individual person is replaced as the purpose and reason of why we do things, then we find ourselves out of sync with the heart of God, and we quickly become not good. And in my opinion, I think this is what we're seeing across the North American church at the moment. And even in churches that are avoiding the limelight for damaging behaviors, for toxic cultures, we're seeing, well, look at it this way, we're seeing people leave the church in record numbers. And I wonder if partly the reason for that is that we as humans, like, we know when we're not valued. We can tell when we're no longer at the center of somebody's aims and purposes. In Luke chapter 11, verse 34 to 36, Jesus offers us a parable that shows us how what we look at or observe, or perhaps even yearn for, affects and shapes us. Jesus says this: your eye is like a lamp that provides light for your body. When your eye is healthy, your whole body is filled with light. But when it's unhealthy, your body is filled with darkness. Make sure that the light you think you have is not actually darkness. If you are filled with light, with no dark corners, then your whole life will be radiant, as though a floodlight were filling you with light. So if Christians and churches take seriously the Abrahamic call to bless and the Isaianic call to be light, then a text like this from Jesus should interest us. Like, Jesus points out to us that if we look at something other than the light, then something unhealthy starts to shape and define us. Like, notice in the middle at verse 35, he warns that it's possible to think you're looking at the light and actually be looking into darkness. And I wonder if this is a really good assessment of where we sometimes find ourselves as the church. we can get carried away with a trend or a way of thinking or a particular new model of church. And this has happened throughout church history, that we all run around trying to pick up on the next big thing. Why do we do this? Because we have really good intentions. We want the church to be good. But if we're not shaping ourselves around Jesus and his way, then we can end up not being the light and not being radiant in the way that we're called to be. What happens is our culture in church then becomes one that doesn't reflect Jesus. And this brings me back round to this book, Church Called Tove. In the book, McKnight and Barringer present what they call a circle of goodness. And this circle of goodness is a map of what a Jesus church culture should look like. Now, if you want to dig in a little deeper into this map, then we're actually discussing the 7 parts to their map in our Short Circle series at the minute, Growing Goodness. And you can catch up with that on our midweek podcast or sign up on the website to engage live. But the Circle of Goodness, briefly, has these 7 parts to it that together guide us and form us into a culture of goodness. And here are the 7 things. Number 1, we must nurture empathy and compassion. Like, churches have often become narcissistic spaces with narcissistic leaders and narcissistic culture. And what this means then is our empathy and compassion for others, particularly the broken or the marginalized, becomes quite low, becomes almost ignored. Like, just think about churches that you know and notice how many of the pastors kind of look like me, while women and people of color, and indigenous people and immigrants are often excluded or ignored or just not represented. But a church that has empathy and compassion reaches out to the people who society isn't paying attention to, who society doesn't seem to care about. Second thing, the culture that we should look for is grace and graciousness. I love this phrase that grace creates space. Like, grace creates space for each of us to journey towards Jesus at a pace that we are able to sustain. And churches often can forget that. Organizations, communities, individuals, we can forget that grace gives you space and allows you to move at your own pace. And what happens when we forget that is we start to exploit people. And invariably what happens then is that people, well, it generates fear, and fear in people that they're not good enough, that they're not where they should be, that there's something ahead of them that if they could just get to, they would be better. And what this does is it creates an excluding culture, and it excludes people rather than practicing the forgiveness that comes from understanding that we're all journeying at a different pace. Thirdly, in this circle is the challenge to put people first. One of the challenges to any church that grows numerically is that if they're not careful, they quickly transition from being a church to becoming an organization. And whenever that happens, we need to be alert to what's known as institutional creep. And this is where slowly but surely we start to think of the organization as more important than the people. And what happens then is people get ranked according to their supposed importance to the organization rather than the other way around, that the organization is seeking to help the people. Jesus put people first. He treated people equally and valued them all, giving everyone space to engage him, even those that didn't like him or agree with him. Fourthly, there's truth telling. The truth hurts, as the saying goes. And as such, it's often tempting for churches, as much as it's tempting for you or me, to resist the uncomfortable truths. And when we resist uncomfortable truths, we then tend to believe or even perpetrate false narratives that are much more convenient. Sometimes it's easier to believe something we made up about ourselves than to actually face the truth. But when we choose to preserve our brand or reputation, or even just the story that we like to tell about ourselves, we're in danger of ignoring uncomfortable truths. And unfortunately, as we've seen in several high-profile cases recently, sometimes when we deny the truth tellers get hurt. So there's work for us to do here. There's work to be done here in a lot of ways. The work of confession and repentance and lament and forgiveness and reconciliation are all caught under this banner of seeking to be a truth-telling people. The fifth thing in this map is justice. Now, I've talked about justice quite a lot in a few different contexts this year. And so, to put it briefly, justice is about doing what's right. But one of the things that gets in the way of doing what's right, quite often, is loyalty. Like, we can become loyal to a particular church or a particular leader within a church. And then as a result, we can tend towards ignoring things that happen that are not good. And justice goes undone because we find ourselves connected to the wrong thing. 6, as we come near the end of this list, is the question of service. Churches are called to serve the world and serve each other in the church. It's there in the call that I mentioned earlier, that we bless and invest in each other. The one difficulty with the current cultural trends in the church is an overwhelming culture of celebrity. Pastors in churches are famed for their so-called successes and not for their service. You can find them on Instagram with thousands of followers, and their celebrity now becomes almost self-sustaining. The vision of church leaders in the Bible is one in which they exist to release everyone into their God-given gifts. But when the leaders become the center of attention, this becomes a worrying sign. Good churches exist in a harmony of people serving each other and the community together. And perhaps it's important to note, by seeing each other as equals in that process. And finally, to complete this circle, in the book of church called Tov, part 7 is Christ-likeness. Be like Jesus. It's notable how when a church becomes obsessed with a leader culture, and the leader is seen as the solution to every problem, two things get talked about less: Jesus and the Holy Spirit. In the first sermon that I ever preached at Westside Kings, I talked about the model of Jesus that we see in Philippians chapter 2, a Jesus who humbled himself and sacrificed for others. That's the Jesus model of leadership. Some scholars refer to it as cruciformity, being shaped and formed by the sacrificial way of Jesus, the way of the cross. Cruciformity literally means cross-shaped. But Jesus doesn't get talked about much as a model for church leaders. Maybe because he'd be a terrible CEO. But I think, and I just wonder what it would be like if we had more churches led by people trying to be shaped like Christ in the way of the cross. Like, if there is a secret to being a good church, perhaps this is it. Put Jesus at the center and keep him there. That's been our journey for a long time at Westside Kings Church. From well before my time in this community, before many of our times in this community, was keep Jesus in the center. And the temptation will always be to replace Jesus with someone else, normally myself. Normally I want to be at the center of it all. Or perhaps something else that we put as most important. But that's why we need Christian community. There's a great line from Rob Bell when he reminds us of this. He says, "We gather once a week to remind ourselves that there's a center to the universe, and it's not us. It's Jesus." So there is no perfect church, and that's kind of the point. In a series called Great to Good, I hope we're not looking for the perfect church. I don't even think we should be aiming for it. We should be gathering together to be a good church. When Dietrich Bonhoeffer was teaching at an underground seminary in Nazi Germany in 1939, this theologian and pastor, he wrote a book on the church called Life Together. And in it, he outlines his concerns from 1939, remember, his concerns about what happens when the church focuses on the wrong things. And he says it like this, and you may want to fasten your seatbelt for the way he goes about saying it. Bonhoeffer says this: "Every human wish or dream that is injected into the Christian community is a hindrance to genuine community and must be banished if genuine community is to survive. He who loves his dream of a community more than the Christian community itself becomes a destroyer of the latter, even though his personal intentions may be ever so honest and earnest and sacrificial. And then Bonhoeffer says this. He says, God hates visionary dreaming. It makes the dreamer proud and pretentious. The man who fashions a visionary ideal of community demands that it be realized by God, by others, and by himself. And he enters the community of Christians with his demands, sets up his own law, and judges the brethren and God himself accordingly. Like, that's a little heavy, Bonhoeffer. But can you see what he's showing us? He's showing us that our dreams and our visions of what our church could be often end up becoming more important than the community that we are. See, the vision and the danger of too much vision, the danger of a vision that's out of line with the call of Jesus, is it calls us not to love the community, but to rather think that if this community was better or bigger or stronger or prettier or richer or more talented, then we could achieve our dream. I mean, this is not the way of goodness. This is a way that leads to blame. And our culture is so often less concerned with goodness and more concerned with who is to blame these days. And the church across the world, hasn't been exempt from that. Subtly, we can join the blame game too. So often you hear Christians talking and we blame society and we blame governments and we blame each other. If our country was better or if our church was better. But when we have a dream of church that we can't achieve and so we start blaming people, do you know what happens? The people that are blamed get hurt, they get marginalized, and they get ignored. And what we end up with isn't the good church of Jesus. So perhaps Bonhoeffer was being prophetic for us. Let's not have a dream of our community that makes us sacrifice our call to be Jesus-centered and good. For a long time, I've claimed the paradox of our strange floor in the West Hall at Westside as a reminder of this. When you get a chance, walk into the West Hall at Westside King's Church and take a look at the floor. I think it's an understatement to say our floor is far from perfect. It tells a story of the multiple histories of our building. It's like a mosaic of different patterns, styles, and perhaps even eras. And I love it because it reminds me every week that the goal of our church is not to be perfect, but is to gather together the people we are into a mosaic of community in all of our uniqueness and be the church together to show God's goodness to the world like Peter called us to. I coined this phrase some years ago and I still love it as a descriptor of us as a community, of this church that was founded in an old curling rink. When I look at this floor and all of it, it reminds me just to say this, that we are finding sacred space in surprising places. And I think that's what we do when we commit to good. We resist the temptation to position our dreams of community above the community that we actually have. Like God has brought us together and we are wounded and welcome. We're broken and brilliant all at the same time. And through the paradox of us being together, perhaps a group of people that nobody else would ever have put together, we place Jesus at the center and we carry something of God's goodness in, through, and to each other and to our world. So what do we do? Well, let me just suggest that we keep placing Jesus at the center, like genuinely. Because placing Jesus at the center genuinely keeps goodness at the center as well. Because Jesus is God's dream for the world in opposition to the dreams that we try to enact. So I'd love to leave you to reflect on it like this. The church is called to live out something called the gospel, quite literally a word which means the good news. This means, surely, that encountering the church should always be a good thing. It should be good news for a person, for their family, their friends, their community, their whole life if they encounter church and the gospel. That really shouldn't be a negotiable. But is that always our experience? And if not, why not? For me, the Church of Jesus is always best when it centers itself on being the people of Jesus and living out his goodness. Remember Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10. We are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. So may we, as God's people, center ourselves in Jesus and do good. May we do good, be good, and live out the good. May we resist all the things that would fight to gain a position above goodness. May we be a good light to the world because we are the people of good news. And may his grace and peace be with you.